Make it 7 straight losses now and an 0-5 road trip as the Kings fall to the Knicks in Madison Square Garden. But you don't care about that. You care about what's happening off the floor with this team. You care about this team being broken up. And as we get closer to the trade deadline and the Kings fall further and further into obscurity, we have more hypothetical rumor and Kings trade talk here on the Locked On Kings podcast, sticking with the Kings and the Knicks, as I'm going to be joined by the hosts of the Locked On Knicks podcast to talk about a Julius Randle trade to Sacramento. Could the Kings pull off the trade for Randle without having to trade away De'Aaron Fox or Tyrese Haliburton? We'll discuss potential trade packages, why Julius Randle is available in the first place, and a whole lot more on today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off season. If you're looking for in-depth analysis, game-by-game breakdowns, highlights, interviews with local and national experts, full coverage of your Sacramento Kings from January through December, this is the podcast for you, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I've been a Sacramento sports media member for the last 7 years. This is my 8th season covering Kings basketball, formerly for Sports 1140 KHTK Radio in Sacramento, now with ABC 10 News and Television. And if you're looking for a conversation about the Kings' loss to the New York Knicks, that's coming at the end of the podcast because I can't be bothered to spend more than a few minutes at the end of the show talking about whatever the hell that Kings performance was. Not that it was surprising in the least that the Kings lost to the Knicks. Not that it was surprising in the least that the team was as terrible as they've been over the course of this entire road trip and couldn't build off of some small momentum in their loss, but good loss, I guess, to the Philadelphia 76ers in game 4 of the road trip. Now, we're going to talk about that later, and I'm not going to talk about that too long because what's more important is what the Kings do at the trade deadline. That's what's been the storyline, and that's what's been the focus for Kings fans really for the last month or so. And as we now transition into the month of February, the final episode here of January, which is crazy to think about already, we get to February, which means it's trade deadline month. And that means we're 10 days away from the trade deadline itself. And I've talked a lot about in recent weeks on Locked On Kings, the longer the Kings wait to make a deal, the more that they fall out of contention. And now with this 7-game losing streak, the Kings are plummeting, somehow still in a somewhat realistic chance of making up ground. It's not like they're completely out of the play-in, but like we've talked about multiple times here on Locked On Kings, this team does not even belong anywhere remotely close to a playoff conversation. And at this point, the team scratching and clawing and fighting, jumping up a few spots only to make the play-in and inevitably lose is just NBA purgatory. This team would be far better off retooling, looking towards this upcoming draft, trying to secure as good of a draft pick as possible while making correct future moves and running this thing back, but differently in the next season and kind of reassessing from there. But we don't know what Monty McNair's plan is. We know he wants to stay aggressive. We know he's going to continue to keep an eye out for players who become available. So it's no surprise that we're hearing rumors, reports, and conversations that the Sacramento Kings are one of the teams that are potentially interested in the services of Julius Randle, who we got to see play the Kings tonight. And Randle's had a down season, to say the least, after his All-Star and All-NBA second-team season last year, where he led the Knicks to a very surprising, entertaining, and fun playoff appearance. But Julius Randle is available. And like John Collins, like Jeremy Grant, like Domantas Sabonis, like Ben Simmons, I expect the Sacramento Kings to be involved in the conversations, if nothing else, to pick up the phone and at least have preliminary talks. So doesn't surprise me at all that there is some smoke there. We haven't seen more than a couple wisps of smoke. No idea if the Kings are strongly considering Randle or if they're chief suitors for Randle. It seems like reports are more trending in the Kings' interest in Jeremy Grant with the Detroit Pistons. But regardless, Randle could be an interesting piece for the Kings to acquire, especially if they're able to acquire Randle without having to give up a whole hell of a lot. And to give us more context of what's going on with Julius Randle, what his price would be, what kind of trade packages the New York Knicks could potentially consider for Julius Randle. I was joined by the two hosts of the Locked On Knicks podcast. I actually joined them on their show. It was their idea to have this conversation. I liked it so much that I wanted to grab a piece of it and bring it here to Locked On Kings. It was a much longer conversation about the state of both the Kings and the Knicks, similarities between the two franchises. You can go and check that out on the Locked On Knicks podcast if you're interested in that. But what I'm playing for you today is just our discussion surrounding a Julius Randle trade. So without any further ado, here is my conversation. A little Locked On crossover, Kings and Knicks trade talks here on the Locked On Podcast Network.
So we've been sort of, tiptoeing around it, but now let's just dive right into the whole Julius Randle discussion. So obviously the Knicks are at a weird spot with Randle right now. We've been talking about it for months. He seems very checked out. It's impossible to miss. We don't want him to be checked out, but it's the writing seems to be on the wall, I guess, that he, for whatever reason, just doesn't feel good on the Knicks anymore or something. Like the way that he plays, the way that he looks on the court. There's been people, taking videos now, like finding little instances of like he's sitting far away from the team in huddles now. He's not helping guys up when they fall over. All these little things. It seems like maybe something is brewing when we now all of a sudden have heard from multiple people last week too that his name is out there as far as guys that might be available on the Knicks. I feel like that is not an accident that all of a sudden his name is starting to come up in trade talks. And so we had Ian Begley, the Knicks beat reporter for SNY, bring up last week that Randle might be on the table. Then one of our buddies, CP of Knicks Fan TV, mentioned that he's heard from someone that Randle has been shopped to as many as 5 to 8 teams, and specifically mentioned the Kings as one of them, which was part of what inspired us to want to bring you on today, Matt, on top of just the fun commiseration session. But where would you think that the Kings fall on Julius Randle interest right now? Obviously you already mentioned you don't think that they would be entertaining a Fox for Randle trade because they would look at that as just like, well, what are we really accomplishing here? And I think I agree with you on that, and I agree from a Knicks perspective that I feel like the Knicks would look at that and say, what are we really accomplishing here? Like if we're trading for this guy in Fox, who maybe it's just bad situation or what, but he is playing worse this year and we'd be committing more money to him than we are to Julius Randle right now, further tightening our options going forward rather than, opening them up more by trading Randle. But there are some intriguing options there. There's a Harrison Barnes on the team, that you could potentially, if the Kings were interested, you could do like Barnes and a pick of some sort, whether it's protected or whatnot. Basically, before we get into actually making mock trades, what do you think that the Kings' interest level in a Randle type player would be?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that the Kings are interested in Randle, but it also doesn't surprise me that the Kings are involved in any conversation. Like the Kings are in a position to where if they hear any remote solid talent is available, if it makes sense, the Kings are going to make a call about it, which again is a breath of fresh air considering where this team was not too long ago, not even trying to make moves like this. I don't know if I like the Kings and Knicks as trade partners, just because both teams are in such similar situations. And I would argue the Knicks are in an even better situation right now than the Kings are, because at least they know that they can get there, and they've been there as early as last season when the Kings don't know what there even looks like. There's a reason why we see typical when there's big name trades happening, it's between a team that is selling and a team that is buying, right? Two teams in very different situations versus the Kings who are kind of on a level, and Knicks who are kind of on a level playing field here, where the Kings are not, or if the Kings are going to acquire Randle, they're more looking to the future and they're not going to sell big today. They're trying to retool. Maybe that team makes a run for the play-in, but they're ultimately looking to build a core that will hopefully make a move going forward. And I think the Knicks would look at a Fox trade at the same or in the same way. So you're basically just doing kind of a, for lack of a better term, a star swap at that point. And I don't know if either team, especially short term, maybe long term, it would be different. And I would argue the Knicks would have a better chance long term of being better than the Kings would have long term in acquiring Randle and getting rid of Fox. But short term, I don't think it moves the needle really for either team that much. So I don't necessarily like the Kings and Knicks as trade partners unless the Knicks are willing, and this is where I want your guys' insight, unless the Knicks are willing to part with Randle for packages that don't include Fox and Haliburton, which I think the Kings would be tremendously interested in that, just like I know the Kings are interested in doing the same with the Atlanta Hawks for John Collins. Randle and Collins both play a position that the Kings need filled, like desperately need filled. And Harrison Barnes has been such a solid player for the Kings. He's been streaky at times, but he's a solid leader. He's a solid locker room guy. The Kings value Harrison Barnes highly. So they're not going to give up Harrison Barnes, who still has more than enough. He has one more year on his contract, but he's got more than another contract in to play. Like, he's in his prime right now. So don't be fooled by Harrison's age, which actually he's not even that old. I think he's like 28, 29 years old.
29,
It feels like he's been in the league for 30 years. I think the Kings would be tremendously interested in like a Harrison Barnes and a draft pick, or Harrison Barnes, another piece and a draft pick type move for Julius Randle. But that's probably the furthest extent that they go.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I can say there's some intrigue there, just because, to Alex's point, things just seem to be so rapidly deteriorating with Julius Randle, where he's sort of saying one thing to like the media and on social media about wanting to be, I mean, the phrase he used was infectious leader, which may be poorly phrased. But he keeps talking about wanting to like be the voice in this team and be the guy who he was a season ago. And yet you see those clips that Alex referenced, like multiple clips now of like teammates falling down around him and Julius just sort of like walking the other way or not being in the huddle. Like, he doesn't seem invested off the court, and he very much, I don't even want to say he doesn't seem invested on the court. The phrase I used last podcast that I'll stick with is he seems lost on the court. Like he just, it's like he got amnesia and forgot that he was that dude a year ago. He was the guy who got MVP picks. He was the guy who made second team All-NBA, because he's not even taking the same shots. And when he is taking the same shots, he went from someone who was so self-assured a year ago to someone who looks like he's praying for the basketball to go in. And I don't really see an avenue for that getting better, because the whole dream with Julius was eventually the Knicks will add another star and he could be that complementary piece. But all we've seen from him this year is an unwillingness to play in that way. And even of late, as RJ Barrett's been playing better and better, Julius has sort of been slotted into that secondary role. And instead of saying, all right, how can I help the team in this role? Probably by cutting off ball a lot, hitting spot up threes, continue to be a smart passer, but instead of being an ultra deliberate one who has to draw a double team and then pick someone out, just making really quick decisions. I don't know if it's an unwillingness or an incapability, but he hasn't shown himself to be that guy. While Harrison Barnes, if you're looking at, again, what a lot of people claim they want the Knicks to be, which is a team that is figuring out what they have in all their young talent, Barnes is such a seamless piece to slot in there. And he's exactly the kind of guy you were talking about the Kings nominally want more of around Fox, and the Knicks should ultimately want more of. Someone who can shoot and just really doesn't take anything off the table in any other capacity, and is just the consummate veteran presence both on the court and off the court. So I think Barnes, maybe, I don't know if this is too lofty, plus the Kings' first-round pick this year unprotected, and maybe they'd be more willing to do that if they were acquiring Julius Randle and all of a sudden did have semi-realistic, at least play-in aspirations. That would be, I don't know if I'd hard commit to that right now, just because of what Julius meant to this team and the idea that there might be more valuable assets out there for Julius in terms of like future talent and upside. But that would sort of intrigue me. I don't know, Alex, what's your take on that kind of a deal?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, I don't really have anything to add as far as what you said about Julius and about how Barnes would fit with the team. I do think that's the most seamless fit that you can find if you're looking for one, like just from a trade partner perspective, like or a matching salary, matching talent level, whatever, like positionally makes sense kind of thing. I think Barnes makes a lot of sense. He also, from the looks of things, is on a contract that scales down in value, which is useful to the Knicks. Even if it's still, $18.5 million next year, that's still a decent amount of savings, probably to reach Julius's salary level. Actually, considering Julius is on the last year of his first contract with the Knicks this year, I think they would work evenly, so you wouldn't even have to add anybody else. This might be my opportunity to quickly get your scouting report on Marvin Bagley in a second, because I've always been curious about him as a throw-in. But just from the perspective of the trade, I'm kind of with you, Gavin. I think that it would be lofty to assume, based off the fact that, unless the Kings really delude themselves into thinking like, oh, we had Julius, this is it. We're making that playoff push and it's going to happen. So who cares if we give up the draft pick? I don't think that they would even be delusional enough to think like, Oh yeah, that's definitely the case. Like this, because it's not like they don't have access to film of Julius this year versus last year. If this was last year's
Nope.
Julius,
The Knicks have hit all of it. They can't find it. There's no.
yeah, right. They've scrubbed all the footage off the
Monty
internet.
McNair's like, oh, can we get some recent highlights of Julius? Like, oh, we just lost him. Sorry.
We lost we lost them all. There was a huge data wipe at the IT
don't
guy.
Check YouTube. He's not on YouTube.
Yeah, the IT guy. He accidentally scrubbed them from the whole internet. But anyway, yeah, I think that I would be on board with, even if it was like Barnes plus, their pick almost protected, sort of like how the Mavs pick is, but maybe with slightly scaling downward protections or something like that. So if it was like top 10 protected, maybe top 10 for 2 years, then top 5 for 2 years, and then conveys as 2 seconds or something like that, I think I'd be down with that. And I think that's fine value for Randle. Barnes is still a great rotation player in the NBA. And to your point, Matt, like, he's really not that old, even if he's one of those guys. Like, I feel like Rudy Gay was this guy for a long time where he was perpetually young and old. Like, he seemed like he had been in the NBA for a million years and yet none at all. Probably because he had stopped at a number of teams and, had played for like 3 or 4 different teams by his late 20s. But yeah, so that's basically where I'm at. Matt, I don't know where you're at as far as that trade, but also if you want to give me my brief scouting report on Bagley, I've been curious about him too, because I'm curious if you think that he's a guy that's totally a lost cause, or maybe could deal with a change of scenery too, and maybe as a throw-in, it decreases that draft pick haul a little bit too.
Yeah, I'll definitely get to that. The way I look at this is, look at the situation. So Julius Randle and Harrison Barnes player comparison. Julius Randle is the better player, we think, right? Can we universally agree that Julius Randle, and he has obviously the star potential, or he's been an all-star, right? He was an all-star last season.
Pure talent-wise, he's definitely better.
Yeah,
he was a deserving all-star and all NBA second team player.
Right. He's also a player that it sounds like the New York Knicks are not necessarily hungry or desperate to get rid of, but are very interested in getting rid of. And the Kings are more hesitant to get rid of Harrison Barnes unless they're getting better. So edge goes to the New York Knicks in this sense, because the Kings getting the better player in the deal. Contract-wise, Knicks are getting the better contract. The Kings are taking on, like you said, a guy who's just signed his contract. He's going to be under contract for the next 4 years. So you're really committing to Fox, Haliburton, and Randle. This big three is going to be something, which is why I think the Kings would want the flexibility of keeping their draft pick this year to add a young, cheap player who could become number 4 or replace one of Fox, Haliburton, or Randle one day, who's not as financially expensive. Of course, Tyrese Haliburton is not that expensive right now either, because thank goodness he was a 12th overall pick. He's being paid $4 million this year, which is absurd for how good he is and how important he is for this Kings team. So the edge contract-wise goes to the Sacramento Kings in this trade. So it's pretty balanced in that sense. Still, the Kings are getting the better player, so they're going to have to pay for that. I don't think there's any chance that the Kings would include this year's pick in a deal unless it was like lottery protected, meaning it would convey to something else. And I don't think the Knicks would have any interest in that, because the Kings are going to be a lottery team. I think Sacramento is smart enough to recognize Julius Randle coming in is not going to get the Kings into the play-in and then through the play-in into the playoffs unless magic happens. So future draft picks, I think there's a conversation to be had, though. I would be, if I'm Monty McNair, if we're negotiating right now and trying to make this trade happen here on our Locked On network, I'm willing to talk about next year's draft pick, a 2023 first round pick that's maybe only top 3 or top 5 protected. Because at that point, if I'm acquiring Randle, I have Fox, I have Haliburton, and a top pick. I damn well better be not a top or not a bottom 5 team. I better be out of that picture, or everything's been a colossal failure. And at that point, draft pick be damned. So I think that's where I'm at, and that's where I believe the Kings would be at in this kind of conversation. Now to the Marvin Bagley thing, I don't know financially if it works, because Bagley's being paid $11 million, I think, this year. And an important note, his qualifying offer is worth around $14 million. However, if he plays less than 2,000 minutes this season and starts less than 41 games, which more than likely he's going to check both of those boxes, that qualifying offer is cut in half to $7 million. So that's important to keep in note from a Knicks perspective. So he was not as expensive to commit to if you were to include him in this deal. But Marvin is in need of a fresh start. And I still think he has all the potential to be a very solid player. He's never going to live up to being a number 2 overall pick. There's nothing that he can do that's going to make that happen. Sorry, as my phone rings in the background.
That's Marvin Bagley's agent.
He's calling me, chewing me out. It wouldn't be the first time they've been upset at me. But Marvin could come to New York and day one be a 15-8, 15-9, maybe even 15-10 guy. He's good enough to put up those numbers just by himself, just because he's just a freak athlete. That part comes easy for him. The question is, can he stay healthy and stay on the floor, number one? And number two, is he going to play a lick of defense, which he's gotten better defensively, but he's still a defensive liability. Let's put it that way. So I think the Kings would more than be interested in including Marvin in the deal financially if they could swing that, especially if it means they have to give up less future draft capital. I don't know how interested the Knicks would be in that sense. I think the Knicks would be happy to take Bagley as a low-risk, potentially high-reward player and a draft pick and a known commodity like Harrison Barnes for Julius Randle. I don't know if the Kings are willing to give all that up, but that's probably where the discussion goes more than in the route of, hey, a 2022 Kings first-rounder. Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Built Bar. January may be coming to an end, but hopefully you're still sticking with those New Year's resolutions, especially if those resolutions are to get healthy, put on muscle, enjoy snacks, but find a healthy way to do so, maybe lose some weight. Built Bar can help you with all of those and then some. Built Bars are protein bars that taste like candy bars covered in 100% chocolate, a massive amount of flavor profiles. So you will find something that strikes your fancy. And I always share that I'm a picky eater. Before Built Bar, I struggled to find any protein bar, protein smoothie, protein-based product that I liked because I tasted more of like the protein supplement than I tasted the flavor profile. Like I would have a chocolate protein bar, a chocolate protein smoothie, or vanilla protein bar, and I would taste more protein supplement than I would the actual vanilla or chocolate. That is not the case with Built Bars. It's like biting into a candy bar, also a very healthy replacement for a candy bar. Like my favorite is mint brownie, and I feel like I'm eating mint chip ice cream every time I bite into the bar. Most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. I encourage you to go and give Built Bars a try. If you've never had a Built Bar before, go to Built.com and order a mixed box. They'll send you a bunch of different flavors for you to try out. And then once you pick the ones that you like, you can go back to Built.com and build your own custom box. And when you do order on Built.com, make sure you use promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com.
That's fair, and it makes sense. And I think from a Knicks perspective, he would be somewhat superfluous with Obi Toppin, and part of the appeal of trading Julius Randle would be to clear up that time for Obi, and putting Bagley into the Knicks kind of confuses things, as it's not obviously not exactly the same type of player, but there's some similarities in terms of their respective strengths and weaknesses. But Matt, we're running a tiny bit long, so just to wrap things up, do you ultimately think the Kings, and I'll let you define this term as you will, make a significant trade this deadline?
God, I hope so. They need to make some moves. And honestly, the significant is like you said, you can define it in different ways. A significant move in Sacramento might honestly be addition by subtraction. Getting rid of players like Buddy Hield, getting rid of a player like Marvin Bagley. Not that Marvin's been nearly as bad as Buddy Hield, in my opinion. But the Kings, I think, will become a better team just by moving on from some guys that clearly haven't worked. Like this group has so much talent, should be so much better than they are, but they just do not play together. This group does not work. So just by breaking this group up, I think the Kings immediately get better. Now, at the same time, too, you're not just going to fire sale talent for nothing. So if they're moving on from Harrison Barnes, they're going to want to get a Julius Randle type change. Gosh, I'm not available.
Bagley's agent is really mad.
He's really on
not like that conversation.
Maybe McNair's calling me saying, stop giving away our secrets here on this in our conversation. So I'll just kind of wrap it up with this. The Kings need to make moves. The only way Monty McNair, I think, gets fired is if he doesn't do anything, which I think the chances of that happening are very, very low. And I would not be surprised at all if there were phone calls happening frequently between the Kings and Knicks involving very similar discussions to what we've had today. If I were to say, if you're controlling the Knicks, I'm controlling the Kings, and I were to say Harrison Barnes and a 2023 first round pick, Kings first round pick, top 5 protected for Julius Randle. Do you guys say yes, no, maybe? Where are you at with that?
As of go ahead, Gavin.
No, I was going to say I'm a solid maybe on that. It's so hard to gauge what Randall's value is around the league, because I almost feel like there is some executive out there that really loves him and says, this is ridiculous. This guy was second team All-NBA a year ago. That player is still in there. He just needs to not play in a system where there's no shooting around him at all. And if one of those people exists, I think the Knicks could maybe get a better deal. If that person, very reasonably given what Julius has done this year and for the rest of his career, does not exist, I think that's an extremely fair deal for the player that Julius Randle has been for the vast majority of his career.
Yeah, I think I'd probably say, as of right this second, I would say yes. It seems like the relationship between Julius and the Knicks somehow or another is broken, and I don't think it's worth even entertaining for another half a season. To just, it's sort of coming at the detriment of some of their young players at this point. Like now, at this point, if Randall's going to continue playing how he has, you don't want to keep him on the court, sopping up minutes that Obi Toppin could be playing, because we've seen that Tibbs is never going to, reduce Julius's minute load, even if he's playing like crap, or if he seems checked out or whatever. That's just sort of Tibbs's mantra, I guess. It's like, keep trying to get his vets, working, I guess. So yeah, I'm kind of at the point where I would take that deal. And honestly, there's a part of me that almost prefers a 2023 first to a 2022 anyway. And I think that would kind of work well for both the Knicks and the Kings, in the sense that, like you said, then the Kings still get to say, hey, we still get to make our pick this year. That's great for us. Then we don't have to worry about losing the pick till next year. So we get this whole offseason to figure it out and hopefully be better next year. From the Knicks perspective, it's considered to be a less decorated draft this year compared to other years. Next year's looks like it could have some really special talents in it. So from a Knicks perspective, you say, hey, we'll just bet on the Kings being the Kings still, and maybe we get a great draft pick next year. And then you also get Harrison Barnes, who can sort of complement your young players well and help you, do some stuff on the court this year and keep things moving along in a developmental sense, because I think the Knicks could still be roughly a 500 team if they committed to and started practicing a version of the team minus Julius Randle. Because we saw a couple games without him earlier this year where it looked ugly, but I think that was mostly due to the fact they didn't know what to do without him out there, because they're just not used to it. I think if you started scheming for a world without Julius Randle, you could get back to around 500 ball and keep this kind of progress going, especially with the Harrison Barnes out there. So I think I'd be on board with it, to be honest, at this point, which is sad to say, but it's just the truth at this point.
I don't believe that the New York Knicks would accept that offer that I put out there at the end there. The Kings trading Harrison Barnes and a top 5 protected 2023 first round pick for Julius Randle. I don't think the New York Knicks would accept that by any means. I was surprised how open-minded the Knicks hosts, Locked On Knicks hosts were to that idea, especially Alex seemed to be interested in that idea. So hey, maybe that is something that could happen. And I personally would be very interested in that deal from a Kings perspective. I think Julius Randle could come in and be a nice fit here in Sacramento, needs a fresh start, it would seem. And the Kings have been looking for someone important at that position. Now, it's a significant financial investment if the Kings were to make that move, because they'd be paying Randle for the next 4 years, along with De'Aaron Fox for the next 4 years. Randle not making as much money as Fox. And then, of course, Tyrese Haliburton is going to have to be paid. And theoretically, the Kings could acquire Randle, make another couple moves at this trade deadline, and still be in a position to secure a, if nothing else, top 7 pick. I don't think that move alone vaults the Kings in such a trajectory that they make the play-in and have a chance at the playoffs. Like if that became the case, if the Kings went on some kind of miracle run with the acquisition of Julius Randle, okay, well, that's one thing, and that's something I guess that would be fun, and we could celebrate and give us hope for the upcoming season. But I would not expect that to happen. In fact, I would more lean into the possibility of the Kings acquiring Randle, allowing the 3 of them just to kind of figure things out while the team continues to lose and puts themselves in a position at a top draft pick. So again, I don't know if the Knicks are game for that kind of trade package. I'm certainly open to the idea. I would not trade De'Aaron Fox for Julius Randle for all those reasons that we discussed in that conversation. But I want to hear from you. Would you move Fox in a Randle deal? Are you interested in Randle at all? Would you, like me, take that package that I put out there in a heartbeat? Or are you hesitant to give up a draft pick? Where are you at with that? And are there other names that you would like the Kings to potentially go after? Let me know at Matt George Sack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. Or if you're watching on YouTube, leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. It was a pleasure to join those Knicks guys. And at least their next podcast is going to be a positive one because the New York Knicks snapped there. I think they had a 3-game losing streak. That snapped. They defeat the Sacramento Kings by 20 points, a game that was not surprising how it played out. Kings offensively, once again, were terrible. De'Aaron Fox didn't play for the 5th straight game. I think he missed this entire road trip, even though he's been with the team with this ankle soreness. And I was discussing with Damian Barling and Kenny Caraway on D-Lo and KC ESPN 1320's primary radio show here in Sacramento. And we were discussing like different theories and the oddity of De'Aaron not being available, how bad of a look it would be if De'Aaron was just okay and chose not to play. It wouldn't surprise me if Fox was like, this isn't worth it, I don't want to play, but that would be a horrible look for him. And from what I understand of De'Aaron Fox and his personality, that doesn't sound like him at all. So I'm not choosing to believe that. I also think it's possible, very possible, that the Kings could be intentionally holding De'Aaron back because they're looking towards a future draft pick. And I know Kings fans would be happy with that clear tanking strategy, although I don't necessarily believe that that's the case either. I do think it's possible from what we've seen over the last few years with this Kings training staff and how the Kings have handled injuries that the Kings are making Fox's injury look less than what it is. They're calling it ankle soreness when really it could be a grade 2 sprain or something like that. For Fox to miss 5 games is, I think, a little more significant than just soreness, unless, of course, they are going the tanking route. And we've seen the Kings say that, Richaun Holmes only had a sore shoulder. That was either last season or 2 seasons ago. They're saying Richaun only has a sore shoulder, and he ended up missing over a month with what was ended up being like a separated shoulder or something like that. Of course, they've done this with Marvin Bagley too, saying, it's just a small injury. It's just a small foot injury. Ended up being like a foot fracture, and he was in a walking boot all of a sudden, which stunned us all. The Kings have done this before. And maybe they're doing it as a tactic to not scare away potential suitors for De'Aaron Fox at the trade deadline, make them think they're not trading for damaged goods. I have no idea. It's just very strange that Fox isn't playing. Not that it matters too much because the Kings are terrible with him, terrible without him. And this team just struggles to score. And they struggled to score across the board. It wasn't just Tyrese Haliburton who struggled. He finished with 16 points. 5 of 13 shooting, 5 of 6 from the free throw line. Davion Mitchell had 13 points. So it was, I guess, fun to see Mitchell and Haliburton playing together as the starting backcourt again. We've gotten glimpses of that recently, and that's maybe one of the only reasons to have any remote excitement for this Kings game. Not that it delivered. 13 points, 6 of 14 shooting for Davion Mitchell, 1 of 6 from three-point range. I guess I like that he took 6 threes. Sucks that he only hit 1 of them. Harrison Barnes was terrible, 4 points, 1 of 5 shooting, went 2 of 6 from the free throw line, which is very unlike him. Mo Harkless, 5 points, was basically a non-factor. Richaun Holmes only played 18 and a half minutes and scored 7 points, had 5 rebounds. He's been struggling to kind of get himself back in a rhythm. Buddy Hield had a very inefficient 11 points on 4 of 12 shooting, 3 of 11 from three-point range. Buddy is shooting himself out of Sacramento, and I'm sure is begging the Kings to move him before the deadline. And at this point, I'm begging the Kings to move him as well. Both parties just need to split and call it a day. Other than that, nothing really to mention from this game. We can mention the stats and numbers for Julius Randle, who wasn't that impressive, just played under 30 minutes, 7 of 14 shooting, 17 points and 9 rebounds. I'll take that over what the Kings had at the starting 4 spot, which again was Mo Harkless's 5 points on 2 of 3 shooting. So I'm definitely interested in Julius Randle. And that's really all there is to say about this game. The Kings are now on a 7-game losing streak. They have the Brooklyn Nets and the Golden State Warriors next. Brooklyn at home on Wednesday, which I would not be surprised at all to see the Golden One Center completely empty. The only reason to go to that game is to watch the Brooklyn Nets. Sure as hell not spending money. I wouldn't spend any money on watching this Sacramento Kings team be an absolute disaster. So if you're going, maybe leave your Kings jersey at home and just go to watch the Brooklyn Nets probably stomp on what looks like an AAU basketball team at this point. If that's what you're interested in, feel free, but I think that building's going to be empty. They're going to lose that game, and then they go to Golden State the following night, where the Warriors will absolutely wipe the Kings across the floor. It wouldn't surprise me again. It would kind of make some weird, stupid sense that the Kings find a way to win one of these games. I wouldn't put money on it. The Kings are looking at another 9-game losing streak in the face. Their first 9-game losing streak of this season, so that's positive. Remember, the Kings lost or went on 2 separate 9-game losing streaks last season. And even after that, I think they have the Oklahoma City Thunder, which the Kings have already lost to them before. Wouldn't be surprising if the Kings lost to them again, especially if both teams are actually pretty close now in the tankathon standings and the running for a top draft pick. So the Kings could easily, the way this team is playing, they could easily reach double digits in terms of a losing streak. So who knows what's going to happen? I'm completely bored and disinterested with this team on the floor, completely invested with what's happening off the floor and what's happening in trades. So that's where our conversations are going to continue here on Locked On Kings. Appreciate your support as always. Tomorrow's Locked On Kings podcast, speaking of off the court stuff and rumors, we had Sam Amick on last week, which is a real treat. I hope you check that out. On tomorrow's podcast, I'm going to be joined by Sports Illustrated's Howard Beck. It's been a while. Last year, Beck joined me, and he and I had a conversation about Monty McNair and Vivek Ranadive and who's actually making the decisions in Sacramento. And that conversation got picked up and traveled a little bit. People were interested in that. So Howard is hopefully going to give us an update on that. Any other rumors that he's heard of involving the Sacramento Kings in the trade market, he'll give his general opinions on where the Kings are at, moves that they could potentially make, who they should be interested in, and who they should avoid, any value that he thinks Kings pieces have. We're going to talk about it all. So Howard Beck of Sports Illustrated, another amazing national NBA personality and writer, will join me on tomorrow's Locked On Kings podcast. So I hope you will join me for that. And then, of course, the Nets on Wednesday, the Warriors on Thursday. And as of right now, I have it planned for Friday's episode of Locked On Kings. I have compiled a collection of my optimistic Sacramento Kings takes from the beginning of the season and from before the season started. And they are rough to listen to. And instead of just talk about the same damn thing with this horrific team over and over again, I thought, why not laugh at my expense? So I'm putting together a compilation of those terrible, optimistic Kings takes with this team. And I'm going to play them for you on an upcoming episode of Locked On Kings, probably Friday's episode of Locked On Kings. So if you need to direct your anger at someone, you can direct it at me. If you just need to point your finger and laugh at someone, I'm going to be pointing my finger and laughing at myself for some of the takes that I had about this Kings team. So I hope you will join me for that as well. It's going to be a jam-packed week of Locked On Kings content. Hope you will join me for each and every single episode. I appreciate you no matter what. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you next time.